Oh yeah, here we go. Episode 117 of Height Drop with Cordelia Hollingsworth, the legend. We had so much fun on this episode. In fact, we had even more fun that whole day, but we were just in a nonstop conversation, catching up. We hadn't seen each other in years. And as you may or may not know, Cory is the executive director and senior coach at Parkour Visions in Seattle. Parkour Visions is the nonprofit organization who's been one of the longest standing organizations in parkour in the United States, and they do some incredible work. Cory really, has been doing a lot of incredible work leading that team, and that includes building parks, parkour parks throughout the Pacific Northwest in the United States and Canada. They do outreach programs for minorities and underprivileged or underfunded, communities. And they're a longtime practitioner and coach. I mean, Cory came through here, through Colorado for a couple of years, and that's how we became friends. And then, basically in this episode, we're catching up. It was kind of like a bit of a mess, but we covered two main topics. We ran around in circles because we just had so much to say, having not seen each other for so long. And then the two main things were the outdoor programs that they're putting out at Parkour Visions and sort of the societal and political implications that are underlying that mission and topical related points. And then as well, we talked about trans athletes in competition in parkour and other more broadly, and kind of the solutions, the issues, the things that already exist, and what might be available to create a more inclusive community. So sorry as well, on this episode, I could have sworn that I pressed the goddamn record button, but I totally missed it. And I've never missed it. And so I apologize to Cory. I apologize to you guys. I'm just going to put up like a freeze frame, or I don't know what I'll put up for the video, but ultimately I'm really bummed out because I hate to miss that. But anyhow, this is just basically going to be an audio picture podcast. I missed the recording on my phone for whatever reason. All right. Much love to you guys. Thank you for listening and enjoy. Welcome to the program. Welcome back to the program, I should say.
Welcome back. Yeah.
You've been on it before.
I don't think I have.
Really?
Yeah, I don't think I ever was.
Not even on one of the...
No, maybe I was.
Oh, like OG episodes. I think you're on one of the first OG,
yeah.
like before we actually launched it again. As I'm going to do some hunting.
Part of me is like has a memory, and part of me is like, did I make up that memory? Like.
Oh man, I kind of want to figure it out right now.
Yeah. Pause everything. We need to figure this out. Yeah, maybe there was. Oh, I think Christopher was on it, and I might have been like in the room.
There.
I was around. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So I don't know.
But you weren't listed in the title like you're going to be this time.
Yeah, I think that was more Christopher's thing. I just happened to be there.
Okay.
That
well,
sorta.
then
But yeah,
officially, technically, this is the official welcome to the program.
Hey.
As the guest.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us and coming all the way from Seattle. We're really lucky to have you. It's been 5 years for us. We've been trying to stop ourselves from catching up nonstop, but
yeah, we go way back.
Way back
To the old Apex
old
Boulder
Apex
days. Yeah.
I mean, you've just had an incredible journey. I don't know where we want to start. I guess like a good place to start is the kind of genesis for this episode, other than us being friends and wanting to hang out and talk with each other, and obviously sharing the interests of parkour, was this post that I made way back. It's maybe not so relevant anymore, but it'd be an interesting place of jumping off, I think. So I made this post when I was in England. I'd damaged this building unintentionally. And you were the only person that, wanted to mention, what we all probably know, which is like, what's going to happen with that building? It's kind of like, I made the joke because I didn't want some of those comments probably coming in, because I don't know what to do. That was like one of the worst scenarios I've ever experienced of like doing real property damage. And so then we had a little short comment section talking about, well, we should talk about this on air.
Yeah.
So
Thanks for being great about that, by the way. Because I was like, I don't know if it's like not okay to, it's like I don't want to like cause some beef by calling out my friend a bit, but I'm like, that's a lot of property damage. Like, and like as I run a nonprofit that is all about sharing parkour with people who otherwise probably wouldn't find parkour, I'm very sensitive to just like the way that the public perceives parkour, and looking at that one and just like, again, look, it doesn't, not that like, I don't know, the general population of people are going to go on Instagram specifically to like a hyper specific, deep in the sport person's Instagram, but I just think about those like optics moments and because it was like a pipe, right, that like definitely took out some cement with it, and they'd probably have to like replace the whole section of the wall at least, I would guess.
I mean, certainly that could happen. In that case, I think what those poles were flag banners, so they can like hang flags. It was the University of Sussex, if I'm not, or I don't know, Essex. It's the one near Brighton that you've seen the store gang if you watch store videos at. And I was meeting up with Joe Hendo there, and we found that, and we did it. And luckily for me, it didn't break when I was like trying to do a flip off of it or whatever.
Totally.
But what happened was,
I'm glad you're safe also. Just
after a few repetitions, that bar, like, it felt pretty sturdy. We hung on it obviously before and did as many checks as we thought were necessary. But then after repeating it, apparently we just knocked it loose, and the bolts, there was like 4 bolts pulled or bent off and broke off. So I don't think the concrete was damaged per se, but either way, that pole is like needing to be replaced, and they might, like you said, actually have to either reinsert new concrete screws if they were going to put it back the same way they had it.
Totally. Yeah, and I think it's the broader thing that I'm really interested in is like this tension between saying parkour is for everyone, and then like the ways that we, I think, as a parkour community from the extreme sport side of things, may be damaging the relationship to parkour. Like I know in the UK there's like now signs of like no parkour here, and my future of parkour is just like parkour is so normal that everybody does parkour. Like in the same way that like running has this like, and I said this in the car as we were driving up, but like, running is like the boring sport that everyone does. Like, I should probably be fit. I should probably go outside. I think parkour, like the everyday's parkour could be that. Like, I should probably go to the park and jump on some stuff, I guess. But like, in order to achieve that future, we have to actually deal with, especially in America, the deep obsession with liability. And this is some of the stuff that like Parkour Visions is doing right now in Seattle, is actually like Parks and Rec, their permitting for classes to run a class in the park only allows you to permit the grass field, which is like kind of a problem for parkour. Like literally like, not allowed to play on the playground. You're not allowed to play on the handicap rail. He's not. And again, it's concerns for like sharing space, because traditionally it's very about like, I'm going to block off this space and this is mine. This is where I teach my soccer. This is where I teach my, whatever activity, versus parkour has a lot more of like sharing the space. There's like pedestrians walking around us, like we're on a handicap rail. Ideally we're like giving right away to the people who actually like are meant to be using it, like disabled people with strollers, etc., people carrying heavy bikes sometimes use handicap rail paths and things. And like, but we have to do a lot for our optics to make sure that we can continue to get permission for those spaces, because if it looks like, even if it's, I don't know, a Karen yells at us or something and then complains to Parks and Rec, that's a problem, right? That's a problem for maybe getting kicked out of the space or losing a permit or things. So like, we've been doing a lot of advocacy work, one being around, we just submitted like a 30-page risk management document that took months to write, and like all these pictures of parkour, of just like very normal, like here's what a step vault looks like, here's what, I'm sure they were expecting something way worse, and we're like, no, it's literally just like, here's some QM on the ground under a rail, So that's some of the work that we're doing. We've also been like working with Parks and Rec to get a parkour park in Seattle. But there's just, yeah, like I said, like there's just so much underlying need to be very aware. Like I would love to, once we kind of tackle the parkour park and tackle Parks and Rec, property as like an officially approved location for parkour, which it should be. It's a place. It's parks are for play. Why can't we do parkour on parks, right? And I will clarify, no one in Seattle is saying you can't do it. There's just a lack of clarity, and we're trying to drive that into like a more explicit permission as opposed to like an implicit permission. But after that is done, I would love to tackle reaching out to college campuses and being, because as everyone's been kicked out of a college campus, and why? Most of the time, there's very little property. It's not like we're dealing a bunch of property damage, hopefully, on college campuses. It has a concern for liability. So I think there's a lot to tackle there, but I think I'm hopeful that there's a way to do it right so that there can be partnerships between parkour organizations hoping to teach people parkour safely to just make fitness more accessible to people. So yeah, that's the stuff I'm interested in, is like, how do we do that? Right? Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing. Where do we begin? I mean, so you put together this risk management document. What other kinds of things and ways are you initiating this path towards what it sounds like is a dream where, excuse me, there might be some of that this episode. Sorry, folks. Where people are allowed to practice in public spaces, and it's explicit. It's
and arguably private
rights.
Spaces too. Yeah.
Oh, and private too. Well,
yeah, because I mean, a college campus is as you're grabbing water, a college campus, is not a public space. It is I actually don't know legally exactly where it is, but I'm pretty sure it's technically private property, given that they have security going around. I also think about like, there's so many courtyards on private property that like is just not being used, and we've all played there. We've all trained on a variety of different places. Like, what if you could just go outside to any nearby handicap rail and play on stuff? The Forbidden Bank handicap rail is no longer the Forbidden Bank handicap rail.
Well, yeah, this hits really. This is very interesting because, it hits right at the core, or the core that with that post was about, which was. Or, what we were talking about was private property, especially. I mean, public property, it's almost a no-brainer, but the fact that you're even aiming towards private property is pretty...
and honestly, even in America especially, like, public property is really... there's no surprise that there's a lot of ownership concerns on, I don't know, to say it for lack of a better word, like a country that was formed on like stealing land. Like there's a lot of possessiveness around land usage, even on public property. Like the way that Parks and Rec does a lot of really great stuff, so I don't want to like throw them under the bus, but like in America, there's just a lot of liability laws, even on public property, that we have to tackle as well to make that a reality.
Yeah, there's a whole conversation there. I mean, a lot of people think property, the whole concept of it is flawed.
Yeah.
And we can maybe get into that later, but
I'm not going to go down a big land back pipeline, but I'm not an expert on that. But
I'm not either, unfortunately. But so how do you see that happening? Like, because to Steelman or whatever the point of view of the property owner, it's really about the liability. That's what it keeps coming down to, right? So the liability, they don't want to get sued by us for our, let's say we roll our ankle or break our leg, or even worse, somebody could die or something on their property, and now somebody's out to start some kind of lawsuit and say that because that building was there. I don't know how they're gonna. I don't know where the logic follows that someone doing parkour like and that kills themselves or injures themselves. Hopefully nothing that serious, but
it's a really
it doesn't
big
follow.
issue.
But it is like that's the excuse. So what do we do about that?
I mean, I think it's very country specific. Like looking at looking at like trespassing laws is one part of the conversation. And I will say these are like big conversations. They're not going to be tackled like within 3 years in Seattle. This is like, I don't know, aspirational. Where does the sport go in like, I don't know, 100 years or something, or whatnot. Because what I think of is like in America, trespassing is a really, really big issue. And I know people who have been on roofs and have been arrested for trespassing and things, versus like if you go to the UK, it's literally not illegal unless someone has told you to leave. Like there's I can't remember the exact name of the law, but it came from the history of like as the country was building, people would just walk across each other's properties to like get to locations. Versus again, America's history is very possessive about land, what is our land and what is not. So like already from step one, it's talking about the relationship to property owner, who owns the property. But it's not like you're not going to go to jail in the UK if you trespass. You'll get like maybe a fine. And I think Storer had to explore this when they went to like China, for instance, as well. Like, what are the actual laws? What are the actual risk? Can I get deported for things? So there's like, just want to like foundationally, that's a huge conversation. And then, but more tangibly, you know, I think it does come down to being involved in local politics to some degree around like, what is your city council? How does your city council interact with Parks and Rec in a lot of ways? Like so we're getting a parkour park in Seattle, and well, fingers crossed, because parkour parks are there are many steps to getting a parkour park, and each one has a possible pitfall where things will not have it happen. But Parkour Visions, even before I was in leadership, was trying to get a parkour park, you know, in Seattle, and for the most part, it was like no, kids, you guys can't, you know, like we don't know what parkour is. What is this, right? Like it's not something that the city of Seattle cared about. So kind of step one for getting a parkour park is getting to be visible in Parks and Rec and like city council, and you know, basically arguing for, it's more than like, I don't know, a couple hoodlum kids that want the space. It's more like, you know, there's a community behind it, and it's going to benefit the greater good to have this as a city. Because it's like, you know, sometimes $500,000 to get a parkour park. So we got attached to a park renovation project that was we met with some of the organizers of that project, and they were really excited about specifically the concept of intergenerational play, because if you know, playgrounds are for 12 and under. And there are some places in the United States where there are laws where if you don't have a kid with you, it's literally illegal for you to be on a playground if you don't have a kid 12 and under with you, which is like bonkers, because where do the adults and teenagers play, you know? But it's like
gotta steal some kids and get
exactly. Yeah, go steal some. No, don't steal the kids. But they're, you know, and these are laws that are intentioned to be anti-gang laws and anti-homeless laws, which is a whole problem within itself of just the way that law is existing. But like New York City is actually one of the cities that.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. I would have thought like pedophile or something. That was like where
probably part of it too.
Probably part of it too. But that's like the primary reason, it sounds like,
from what I understand. Again, like this is something I'm like on the tip of the iceberg of discovering, because I'm discovering politics through parkour, which is a really weird place to be, as opposed to like any other way you could get into politics, but like very hyper local politics. But yeah, so New York City is also very interesting because they have a initiative where they want everyone to be able to have a park within something like a 5 or 10 minute walk of where they live. So there's some stuff like that that's actually really, really cool. And there's issues nationwide about the concept of like a play desert. If you've ever heard of like the term food desert, right? About like these places where there's either no food or lack of grocery stores, you know, like actual food as opposed to just like a quickie mart or something.
Food and liquor stores and like whatever, like nothing of nutritional value really.
Yeah, so there's that, but then it's also been sort of co-opted to talk about play deserts, which is especially in low income, marginalized BIPOC communities. Oftentimes there's not like a playground because the city hasn't invested in that community. So what we got attached to this. I'm gonna go all over the place with my conversations, but
we're gonna have to. Unfortunately, I was
there's
like,
a lot to cover.
There's so many things, and I'm like, oh my god, I wish we would have written something down. Maybe we could organize it. I don't think it would have helped too much because there's just too much to talk. But
just go over it.
I love to go around in wiggles.
Let me draw a chart out on all the different intersections of accessibility to play. but so this park that we are attached to is in a mixed income neighborhood, this park renovation project, where it was promised by the city to renovate, and then they never did. And so it's a level of holding the city accountable, especially after like BLM protests. The city has been paying more attention to it, thankfully. And that's not our part of it, but when we met with the organizers, we met, we agreed on a lot of values, and they were very interested in intergenerational play and that whole concept. So I think that's the power of parkour, and one of the many benefits of parkour is like, we're like in our 30s, but we'll train with like a 16-year-old, or like my communications director, they're in their 40s, and she has her like 7-year-old kid, and they literally go out and train together. And like, if we want to talk about issues of health and issues of like our sedentary lifestyle, like one of my favorite statistics is the average 19-year-old is as sedentary as a 60-year-old in America, which is terrifying to think about. So so like there's that. There's also just like one of the major causes of death for seniors is falling and breaking their hip. Like literally not even be able to get off the floor is a huge issue. So like, I mean, like PK Move out in Virginia is doing some really great work with teaching seniors how to fall through parkour, and like, and also just more importantly, proving that parkour can teach people how to get off the floor and build strength to get off the floor, in addition to like avoiding the fall entirely. So like, yeah, there's a lot there. But in terms of getting this park going, we had initial conversations with the organizers. And then there were different points when they brought us out to community events, and we just brought like little scaffolding, like pop-up kit that we just like set up. And because we run an organization and are deeply connected to the Seattle parkour community, we're able to bring out like, I don't know, 50, 75 people of all ages. And then seeing some Parks and Rec officials were there, and they're like, wow, this is really cool. Like, one, nobody's getting injured. Look at, like, I've never seen something like parkour before in person. So I think that's a really, really important thing, is like, we need to be more visible. Like, in addition to that, like Parkour Visions does all of our adult classes outside, and you start to notice like week after week, instead of it being this thing where like pedestrians and onlookers are like, hey, what are you doing? Get down from there, turns into instead this sort of like, oh, that's just the parkour people. They're there every Wednesday. And it helps normalize parkour for people. And I think that's the underlying, like, while there's always going to be a limitation to how many laws we can like change, and like, liability in America is a huge, huge thing that I don't think it's going to take a long time to even chip the tip of the iceberg on that one. I think we can do a lot socially to help normalize parkour in the view of the public. This is why like old school like leave no trace jams that are just park cleanups are extremely powerful, especially if you have, I don't know, like your local news network report on it as well, or you do that intentionally in partnership with Parks and Rec so that they know that you exist when you do it. That's some of the stuff that we're doing in Seattle.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, you do so much great work. Like, I wish I want to open it up and kind of, for anyone that doesn't know, I mean, I'm going to introduce you in the beginning of the episode. I always do a little introduction and things, but can you tell your story a little bit, and how you became like the director of Parkour Visions, and maybe even within that, Parkour Visions it has one of these accolades of being like the first parkour program in the Americas, or something like that, or the first location or something like that.
Yeah, it was one of the first.
It was one of the first, and not that it like it's like
yeah,
a huge deal which one was first, but it's been around for as long as any organization has been around in the United States.
Absolutely.
And so it's definitely a really cool thing to see it still around. And then I would just want to hear kind of like where you're at, and then share with everyone, like, because obviously you came through Colorado, and that's how we became friends and things. But
so Parkour Visions was one of the earliest parkour organizations. It was the first nonprofit for parkour, a 501c3. So it started by a group of volunteers who was the board of directors. Some of the most well names for that from that era that were some of the founders were like Rafe Kelly, Tyson Cheka, Brandy Laird, Janine Cundy, and some other folks involved as well. And they really wanted to get parkour, I think normalized is a good word for it, and did it. And back in the early days, did a lot of like stuff like parks cleanups. I remember going to like women's jams like very early on to my first years of parkour. Back a lot of more of like let's just work with Parks and Rec. They did also end up opening up a gym. I don't remember the exact year that the first gym was, but it was like this tiny gym space. And so it had a gym for about 9 years. And then right before the pandemic, kind of in a weird silver lining, lost the gym, and which did help us, I would say in some ways, like survive the pandemic because we didn't have this huge overhead. But it was really hard any community who's lost a gym knows the like grief that goes into losing a like community space. So it was a big transition phase. But I think it was really important for Parkour Visions to rediscover its original voice and also build on it, because I think the original need for having a gym was because it was so hard when, 15 years ago. This is also our 15-year anniversary, which is cool.
Happy birthday,
Parkour Visions. Yeah, PKV. So
happy quinceañera, maybe. Even.
Yeah.
You do a big celebration.
Yeah. So back in the day, 15 years ago, nobody knew what parkour was, and didn't. It wasn't really like safe to take classes outside, and you'd get kicked out of spots, and it was hard to build those relationships. So I think especially in America, it's been really important for us to build safe spaces to train, which is what gyms provide. It's like your personal clubhouse where you're never going to get kicked out from your training spot, right? And but when we did lose the gym, so Tyson was the first executive director. And then Caitlin Pentrella was the second executive director. They hired Caitlin actually right before they lost the gym. It was completely unrelated. They were like, we need a new ED. Tyson's ready to step back after like a decade of doing that work. And then Caitlin came in and did a lot of great visionary work around like what could PKV be in a way that really deep dives into being a nonprofit, more like doing fundraising and doing grant writing, like that kind of stuff that you think about with nonprofits, and really leaning into like, what does parkour still need in the world? And I think because there's been so many gyms that have been popping up, I think a gym is less needed in Seattle or in America, period. I think what's needed is somebody to hold the torch for outdoor parkour, which is what we've really been looking at, is like the direct benefits of outdoor parkour. And how do we keep parkour accessible as well? It was a large conversation. If you look at like the history of parkour, literally was like a bunch of like kids in a ghetto that started parkour. And to see the way that gyms are building a paywall for people to learn parkour now, I think that's something as a community we need to be aware of and responsible for. And also, like, a for-profit company has a limitation to how much they can do that, and that's just the nature of the structure of a for-profit company. Plus, you got a lot of overhead for running in the big warehouse. So running these outdoor classes focused on folks that are marginalized from fitness has become a big focus, or has been a renewed focus, I think is more fair to say. Like, Parkour Visions has always done work with like homeless youth. We recently, this last year, served 400 different kids in South Seattle, a lot of low-income neighborhoods. A big shout out to Lex Dye, was our program coordinator for that and is now our head coach. They did amazing work for that. So that's a bit of, and also while Parkour Visions had a gym, Tyson and Colin McDonald were doing a lot of work on how do we get more parkour parks. And while the city of Seattle wasn't really biting, they were able to design, Colin especially designed, I think 8 different parks in North America. And so it's been so much easier to come back to Seattle parks and say, well, look at this portfolio of parks that we've built, or designed anyways. In addition to like having this community behind us when showing that there's dedicated interest. It's not just like, I don't know, a team of 10 people being like, I want a parkour park to train on. So that's Parkour Visions. For me, so I have been doing parkour for about 13 years, I want to say. And I started at Parkour Visions back when it was called the Pacific Northwest Parkour Association, which is a huge mouthful. The PNUPWA.
I'm glad they shortened it.
Yeah. So I was not an athletic person at all. I just was like big video game nerd. And actually, the why I found parkour was when I went to Vancouver Film School up in Vancouver, Canada, and happened to see a short film that Renee Scavington was in that somebody had filmed of him. And that's where I first saw parkour, was like this short film at film school. And that was like cool and sat in the back of my head. And then at the end of film school, developed an eating disorder and basically like was like, I'm gonna do everything I can to be thin. And so I tried like karate, and I tried a personal trainer, and I happened to be back in Seattle, and I Googled Seattle parkour classes, and that's how I found Parkour Visions. So eventually like got through my eating disorder. There's a lot we could talk about how having an eating disorder and the underlying thought of I'm not good enough comes up in being an athlete as well, and having to navigate that space too. It almost became like, okay, I'm no longer bulimic, but now I'm like unhealthily obsessive with being good at being an athlete. And that took a lot of years to dismantle. Also like shout out to like Castery from Esprit Concrete. They literally do therapy with parkour and work with parkour athletes. They're in the UK. Amazing organization that I worked with as well to help break some of those habits. But so that happened. So all that happened.
There's like a transfer of unhealthy patterning into slightly healthier patterning. And then from there, it feels like you can get the roots to transform it into healthy patterning.
Yeah.
Is what I've seen it experienced as, I think.
Totally, yeah.
I don't know. Like, I didn't have an eating disorder, but I had a drinking problem, you could say. But anyhow.
Yeah, I mean, and this is something we kind of chatted about was like there's this phase, I think a lot of people in their early 20s, at least in our generation of parkour, use parkour as like this escape, you know, and sometimes an escape from just living a comfortable life, you know, or living a normal life or something. And now we can play more freely, you know. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we had a really fun conversation about just how why is this still on? Oh, that's why. I'm hearing it through the headphones.
Oh yeah, do your thing.
Sorry, it's just I didn't do that. Okay. The idea that and I've talked about it I think a few times on this podcast, but it's just like, trying to escape, like you said, get it out of whatever it is that you're running from, whatever trauma you might have experienced or did it, but you just decided, like, the analogy I made, which is often made, is the Never Never Land, Peter Pan syndrome, and trying to basically never have to actually grow up and become who you were maybe actually here to be, but it's a scary thought, I guess, for a lot of young people growing up, and parkour gave a safe space to just kind of be anything you wanted, including
totally.
including a kid forever if you can swing it. But then you realize, or this is what I would mention to you, is like ultimately there's like a lot of ways out of this rabbit hole, but one of them was, let's say you figure it out, you try to like do it, and you're like, wow, I've kind of established this life for myself where I could be a kid. You might actually realize at the end of that road that you're still not fulfilled because there's something underlying that you realize you're running from, and it's not actually making you happy to like just be a kid or to escape life or escape your responsibilities. But then, there's also I don't know what we were talking about or what we had mentioned there, but it was like something to the degree of there's so much more on the other side of that, though. Essentially, all that to say, just like when you do embrace it, or okay, so you can kind of complete the game, is what we talked about. You win the game, like
because you were a competitive athlete.
You
who
hit
like,
all the Like I was telling you how when I was a younger practitioner, I would just love. That was it for me. It was like going hard, doing the coolest things I think I could do, and trying to like just exponentially grow. And then I hit a point where kind of simultaneously I had hit everything that I wanted to do. I'd kind of completed every check mark that I really wanted, and it was still unfulfilling. And simultaneously I couldn't go any further without destroying my body or destroying my stability in life. And so even if you hit everything, you're going to hit the other way out of the rabbit hole, which is like you realize that there's not a future maybe in the current path you're on. And this isn't specific to parkour. This is anything. If you attach your identity, I think, to trying to build yourself in a way that's maybe, again, it's healthier than where you were at. Maybe like parkour kind of got me off drugs and got me off of drinking because I had to take care of myself to be a good athlete, but it still didn't like get to the root of the problem. So then you come to the point where you're like, okay, I'm ready to deal with the root of it. And it's a difficult thing, I think, for a lot of us, but also there's so much more on the other side of that where you're like, okay, now my life is a lot better. And I don't know why I was so worried about growing up and making, like you said, living a better life, living a comfortable life. Like, why was I so attached to this idea of grinding?
And you see so many people who, like, you know, as we're now, like, what, I'm 33. How old are you?
34. Just turned 34.
So us old parkour elders at the
Respect
ripe
your
old
elders.
age. You know, like, I've seen people who have dedicated a decade of parkour, and then they get out of it being like, okay, but I literally have no other life skills. How do I get a job? How do I, you know, I don't want to live in a van for the rest of my life. I don't want to live in a rental unit where we're renting a house with like 6 other athletes and the kitchen's always dirty, you know, like, and I've been there. I've done the van life. I've done the, you know, live in a parkour house kind of stuff.
That's the hard realization is like realizing you don't want that.
Yeah.
Like those are the check marks. You're like, if I could just be with my friends all the time, I could just travel the world in a van and that's all I need. And then you do that and you're like, oh shit.
Yeah.
This kind of this actually is not what I want.
Yeah.
I actually want the house or like the, you know,
I want health insurance.
I want to feel safe. I want to, whatever. Sorry to cut you off. But
also to go on a tangent about health insurance, speaking about like parkour, you know, a big issue that we have in terms of liability, right, is like some of the reasons why people sue when they get injured on public property or private property is because health insurance is so, you know, such a mess in our country. So like a great example of that is, you know, if somebody gets injured on parks property, they're going to sometimes just have to sue everyone, even if they don't feel like it's a personal, you know, want to. It's just like, I need to sue because I need this money because maybe my insurance isn't covering this, or, you know. So I think that is a larger thing that we need to do in parkour, is just be aware of our relationship to, I don't know, again, like larger liability, but then also in another side, I have so many thoughts on this. I'm trying to like not whirlwind spew everything out of my brain, but I think it's also important for us in the parkour community to think about things like health insurance and injury prevention for our coaches and our athletes. Also, I'm on the board of USPK, United States Parkour Association, the governing body for American parkour, and we've just built a partnership with Spot Insurance. So if you are a member of USPK, which there's like a couple tiers as individuals, like a pro and an individual, if it's like $50 a year or $70 a year, you now, every time you're doing parkour, are under the insurance that we've got, what we've worked through Spot as a stopgap, because there's so many people in parkour who literally are like, I tore my ACL and I don't have insurance, you know, like what happens, right? And that can be devastating for someone financially. And if you don't have, you know, a career that isn't athlete based, like that's a lot to deal with. So
you would know
Yeah.
firsthand, I would think.
I mean, shoot, even having like a full-time job, sustainable, like, I'm pretty lucky to have like a sustainable financial career in parkour and like have benefits. I just tore my ACL last year, and it still is like thousands of dollars that I'm having to pay out of pocket on top of health insurance, because of wonderful American health insurance issues. So.
Oh man. Yeah. Like everything's kind of interconnected, these liability problems, these health insurance problems, they're connected. The whole property, like, it's tied up in that because people are always out to make profit, and like it comes down to this money thing, and the value structure of our culture in America, at least, is money is king still here, pretty much. And I feel like we're moving towards something that's maybe more true to our nature, and we're actually kind of dissolving that story, and like it's actually not king, it just feels that way, or it's like that's how it looks on the outside, and that's how people behave when they're sort of being unconscious. But it's evident in the work that you're doing that we're trying to build a better world with more freedom and more play and more people feeling fulfilled in their lives. And because I think, again, it ties into all the things, all this quiet quitting and like all the shit that comes with millennials and stuff. It's like, it's like we're trying to figure out a way around, like, why did life should not have to suck this much?
Yes.
It just shouldn't. We know this in our hearts, and so we're trying to figure out solutions. And it's not that it sucks, for everyone, obviously. But
it's
it
just
is
lopsided,
like, we can feel it. And that's like, there's a lot of work to be done, and it's cool to see that you're doing so much to empower people with parkour. And I'd love it if you tell us like a little bit more, if you can kind of build in the nutshell version, or we can expand on it, obviously. But I can see, and I feel like, and it's again evident in what you're doing and the way you're applying your life, that you really value parkour as something that everyone can benefit from.
Totally.
Or that anyone can benefit from. Can you tell us more about like your kind of thoughts on that, and just why is parkour so valuable to the people?
I mean, I think besides the obvious to us but not obvious to the onlooker of like falling safety, which is just huge. Like, honestly, if just everyone knew how to fall safely, like, I think that would be, even if we like failed at all the other ways that parkour can benefit people in the world and just taught everybody falling safe, like some ukemi, I think one of the that question of how do we get seniors to not, like, I mean, yes, people get old and break down, but I think that, this is gonna sound weird, but like there are other ways that people can die, and like let's like outlive, have our bodies be safer, and like help that have a lifelong sort of healthy aging. I don't think that starts in teaching seniors how to fall. I think that is a necessary thing that we do also need to do, but like you need people to be not sedentary, their whole entire life. Like, what would it look like if adults were playing, through their 60s, like from 20s to 60s, right? Like, what would that look like if parents were not so stressed out? Like right now, parents have a hard time being fit because it's like it's very separated. You have your kid life, and then you have your little time left to do your own thing. And I think just being able to do parkour in a park with your kid is a great bridge to have adults be safer, in terms just from the falling safety perspective, right? What would it look like if parkour was in schools? Like when I think about the phrase physical education, like PE, I don't think ball sports is like the answer to physical education. It's cool and does teach a lot of like life skills, like collaboration and blah, blah, blah. But like, I think falling safety is like physical education. So I think that's a huge missing as well. I think so that's like thing one, falling safety. Thing two is I've had the privilege of being in a variety of conversations in a variety of marginalized communities and getting to listen in on, on these conversations. And the thing that keeps landing true is the sense of belonging that happens in parkour, because there is this relationship to space. I remember like in my parkour journey, I learned from like Dylan Baker, and like I remember a private lesson with him where like he was like, the way that you stand on the sidewalk is like you don't belong here. And I was like, what? Like, he's like, yeah, like if you're doing your run up, like at least like, you know, like kind of like this is your space. Like it's okay to like have your space in the sidewalk. And that was like a life-changing moment, you know, and I see as like someone who was socialized as a woman growing up, right? Like, or as a girl, like assigned female at birth. That for women, there's a lot of like, don't be in the way of people, right? That sort of shows up, or like you take a second, you are not as important as men is sort of like the underlying, sometimes intentional, sometimes unintentional message that you get from society. So being allowed to take up space for women is really important. There's very important race issues that we need, that like I've seen parkour be impactful for. Like there's a long history of police presence in parks, that if someone is not white, especially if they're black, they are like getting the cops called to them just because they're playing in a park, right? So like the power of being able to belong in a public space is huge. We could look at it from like a disability lens as well, like where the disability sort of underlying message is like, you don't belong here. We're not even going to make space for you. If we do, it's like, you know, here's the main entrance to the building, and here's the like side entrance that disabled people can use. There's a lot to go in that I think is really fascinating and horrifying about segregation of disabled people in our society. Let alone that like the reality is everybody is going to be disabled at some point in their life, whether it's just from old age, or you were born with a disability, or someone like me. I spent 2 to 3 months in a wheelchair because of when I initially got injured in my ACL, from my ACL tear, it like healed wrong and I couldn't walk and had to do a bunch of PT before my surgery. So like, yeah, and it was just eye-opening to be in a wheelchair and be like, oh, literally there's like so few curbs in my neighborhood that I can even get off the curb to cross the street in. Or there's just like even the tiniest grade of hill is just, you know, you have to be really like, I've got upper body strength because I'm an athlete, and like even it was hard for me, you know. So there's that perspective. I think it's also really important for men's health as well. I think there's a lot of great conversation happening about women's issues in parkour, and we're not talking enough about like men's health and the intersections around that. But yeah, that underlying message is a sense of belonging, and our community, for most people, I would argue, is, and I kind of waver because I know many folks who are marginalized within parkour as well, is a very hot topic, and it does happen. Because we're not invisible to society's influence, right, as a community. But that is one of the larger benefits of parkour, is not only belonging within a community that is intergenerational and intersectional, but also a belonging in physical space as well, and a relationship to space that I think is really, really important, where like, because I do outdoor parkour almost entirely now, because we have almost all of our classes are outdoors, I'm very aware of climate change. I'm very aware of like how many unhoused people are living in the Seattle area. And I think as a society, we need to have more exposure to these issues, because it's harder to ignore them when they're like right in your face. So
interesting.
Yeah,
that last part especially, I mean, it's interesting. The way you made me think about it is just like embodiment. Like it's so powerful because it gets you empowered in your body, and like that's that kind of addresses a lot of big things and conditioning that happens that you can kind of reorient and decondition from using parkour. And the other thing that jumped into my head when you were speaking was like a sense of dignity, you know, that is like not afforded to everyone, that I think is part of what's tying into this, is like people, I don't know, does that land for you?
It
like,
totally
what do you think
does,
about
that? I think dignity is a great word for it. It also makes me think about, like, we kind of talked about like the coping mechanisms that people have for like traumatic experiences in their life, whether it's an eating disorder or drugs and alcohol or a myriad of other things. You know, we do live in a very imperfect society, and I think it's important as we grow parkour to try our best to not duplicate harmful systems. And this is why sports has always been political, and the more that parkour grows beyond being like informal communities, the reality is this is a political conversation, like having equal pay for women and men for prize money in competitions is huge and revolutionary. And like, I don't know, you look at like the NBA and the WNBA, right? And they're not even trying to the WNBA is not even trying to advocate for equal pay. They're advocating for an equal percentage of pay based off of the revenue. And I think parkour right now, it's important for us to do equal pay for both divisions, because it's setting the precedent of we're not going to grow so large that we become like the WNBA and the NBA, where we're just like, it's too late to fix it. I think that's the kind of like messaging that we want to create with our systems. There's a lot that we could do. I think we're at a turning point for parkour of how accessible are we really going to be, because you hear this a lot of like, oh, parkour is for everybody, and like parkour is really inviting, and like, yes, I think a lot of most people have that intention, but I don't think people are always aware of like the harmful impact that just like, I don't know, society as a whole can have on folks, and we're replicating those things. Or maybe some people are aware of it and just don't care, but I optimistically think it's hopefully the first one that people are, less aware of the issues that we can create by replicating, pay structures. And,
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. I don't know how life works completely or anything, like, obviously, but
who does, right?
Who does, but it's just interesting because I mean, what I'm thinking about when you're talking is, and what I'm hearing is we're kind of, it could be on us, and I think you're championing this responsibility, taking and instilling and creating a culture that has these values that aren't the same as the old structures, and it really instilling them. And it's interesting to me that it's like, well, what would carry that torch? How are you going to seed new value structures without at least a community around it? So it's just fascinating to me that parkour can maybe be a community that is like that. And obviously there's probably dozens and hundreds even of other communities that are on a similar mission or share some of those just goals towards moving the value structure in a certain direction, so that it is not not repetitive of these like traumatic structures. And I don't know.
There's so much in that.
It's just like, it's just like, it's such a massive concept, and also it's just so cool. I guess where I would take it, one thing that I had a question about, which I think would be cool to pull us apart, because again, I like to sort of play my own devil's advocate at times, and like, where, we talk about this phrase, parkour is for everybody. We mentioned it a few times. Is parkour for everybody?
Depends on the kind of parkour.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So this is the kind of like the foundation of kind of what you're bringing, I think, is you want to make it for everybody. Is that correct? Or you just want to make it not forcing it on everybody, obviously, but
totally
making it accessible so that people don't feel excluded.
Yeah, and that is a huge thing. I will say that I think obviously there's already sort of like different kinds of parkour that are emerging, like even if we're just talking about like the recreational practitioner versus like the competitive practitioner, or like the extreme sports side, if they don't do competitions, like roof culture type stuff, like we can still draw parallels to other sports, like, I don't know, skateboarding or rock climbing, of like, there's the recreational rock climber at a gym, and then there's like, or even like the recreational outdoors person for rock climbing, and then there's like the like extreme death defying people.
There's Alex Honnold.
Yeah, exactly.
There's like the Adam Ondra, who's like very different style of climber. I don't know how into climbing people are, or you are. Yeah. But there's all these archetypes that are like very, very different now, that are kind of like fully expressing.
And I think it's more about like, if we want to say parkour is for everyone, I think it's like, what are the different kinds of parkour that are emerging, and who's holding the torch for different kinds? And do any of them have conflict with each other, right? Like, as we've talked about, like, as we kind of started the podcast about, like, roof culture can negatively affect getting parkour parks in our cities. I'm not going to say it's like a 1-for-1, like that is the reason, like there's obviously a lot more, but like it's stuff that we want to be aware of these, where these, again, the word of the day I think is intersectionality, like where do these things intersect? So, I see, again, with outdoor parkour and the benefits of being outdoors, and being in your city and being more related to your city and the more places in your city, and like all of our adult classes are free, for instance. And so we have, for people who truly can't afford it, great, there's no barrier there. And then for people who can't afford it, oftentimes they end up becoming donors for the nonprofit. So it's kind of like a sliding scale model. And like, you get people across social economic barriers interacting with each other, which is, again, an issue in our society. But that kind of parkour, there's that. I'll just say there's all of that. And then there's so the recreational versus like extreme sport parkour. There's also intentionally being inviting to people who were historically marginalized, sometimes does not feel inviting to people who already feel kind of like top dog in the community. Like a great example of that is, if anyone's been following over the past decade plus, like the way that women's issues within parkour has evolved. Like I remember when I first started parkour, there was like a couple women in our community, and I was like lucky to be in a community that had a lot of women, like, so you kind of get this early phase of, so I see this like spectrum of how do you bring in a marginalized community, or spectrum of community engagement type thing. And stage one is like sort of like a denial, there's no problem, we're just looking from like a women's issues thing. And some folks are still in this stage of like, it's not really our focus to try to get women in parkour, or like, I'm not misogynistic, so it's not a problem, or like just sometimes in denial, or sometimes just not focusing on women's issues. Then you get this next stage of when you start being more accepting, you get sort of like this, like stage two is like this token stage where there's like the token girl, and usually the token girl is somewhat like of a tomboy, has more like maybe mental armor towards some like misogynistic things, like just being like, don't be a pussy, and like that sort of languaging, and like, while just because you say don't be a pussy and don't be a bitch doesn't mean that you are like a deeply misogynistic person. It is, it can be that space is not welcoming for women, right? Because the underlying message is, being a woman is weak. So you get these like very thick-skinned sort of stereotypically tomboy sort of token women that are in there. And then the next stage for there that I've seen is a stage where it's like, let's create dedicated spaces for these people. There's a want for like a women's only jam, or a women's only class, or something like that, right? And at that stage, I've definitely noticed pushback, sometimes from men being like, well, where's the men's space, right? Or why does this need, like just a lack of understanding as to why there may need to be this like safe space. And then sometimes also a pushback from some of the women as well. Like, I was actually very anti women's only spaces and like essentially gender segregation for a long time in competition, in just jams as well, which also is like ironic to me now that I've come out as non-binary. But like, regardless, when I did actually go and attend those, I was like, oh, I understand why this exists, because hearing so many women, like I remember going to my first ever like the North American Women's Parkour gathering and being like, I've never seen so many women in one place, and some people there were like, I've never trained with another woman, period. So it was like it was just mind blowing for them. It was a great experience for them. And then with competition as well, while I have complex feelings about gender in competition, I did feel a sense of belonging because there were challenges at my level. And there's a whole rabbit hole that I hope we can have time to go down and talking about gender and talking about,
it's cold as nuts outside. There's nothing to do out there.
It's like 6 degrees or something outside in Denver.
We got time.
So yeah, like at that stage, there are, there's pushback for building this inclusion. And then the assumption is that when you build this safe space, more people are going to join a co-ed space. And I think that is sometimes true. Like, one thing that we need to also recognize is sometimes these committed communities, like, it's okay for parkour, a women's parkour group, to be your safe haven from the misogyny you experience in the rest of your life, and you don't really want to deal with misogyny in parkour too. Like, that's okay. Some women will never join co-ed spaces, and I think that's a hard one for us to grapple, because I think the default idea of parkour is for everyone is like a coexisting location space for everyone, and that's just not the reality of life.
Yeah, it's like I mean, let me see if I can kind of catch on to that real quick. Are you kind of saying parkour's for everyone, but it doesn't mean everyone at the same time in the same place,
Totally,
in the same rule set and the same like culture? It's like parkour's for everyone in that we want to make it accessible for anyone and everyone to express it in whatever way makes them get the most value from it.
Yeah, exactly. So like, and that's, I do hope that, there is, I would say, a final stage for communities where the co-ed space does really start to show up when there is representation of female leadership, right? And this is, and like I've attended talks at like Art of Retreat where like some of the actions look like, a website is not just a bunch of pictures of like men doing big jumps, like maybe you have women doing big jumps, but probably more accessibly you have men and women who are doing not big things as well. Like you got to market to the people who are going to be inspired by it. Not everybody's inspired by big jumps is a hard pill to swallow for some people.
And by the way, the people that are inspired by big jumps, they're gonna find the big jumps.
Totally, they're gonna find the big
out
jumps.
there.
Yeah.
You don't need to take care of those guys or gals or anybody. Like, it's just
totally
easily. I mean,
yeah, exactly. Like,
they're not the ones. Like, there's often the most spearheaded folk that really they I don't know.
And I'm here for big jumps. Like, I'm not even, but I think
I'm here until my knees explode.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. As having one knee that has exploded.
None of my anti-big jumps.
Yeah. Medium-sized jumps as we get older. Yeah, like what's made Parkour Visions, like the Seattle community, I think have a lot of women's participation in co-ed spaces is there's like female coaches, and I've seen that other communities as well have been really great in doing this. Where there's female coaches, there's female leadership running the business as well. That helps break down some of those stereotypes. It can be really hard to bridge the gap from women's only spaces to more consistently co-ed spaces if it's all men making decisions, is because there's just a lack of like lived experience. There's a lot of well-intentioned men that I don't want to even say is like men can't make decisions about women, but like you just always need to bring in the stakeholders who are actually affected by policies that are, being made. But I do see that sort of like spectrum of stages of like community involvement, I guess, as something that can be replicated in a variety of ways, hopefully. So
I hope so too.
Yeah.
All right, what's next?
Yeah, I know. It was like, that was a big tangent. Where do we wrap? Yeah. You go.
I was going to say, you kind of like started opening that conversation on complex feelings for competition and gender.
Yeah.
I don't know if you said you maybe want to dive into that, but it's a big one. Do you want to still?
Yeah, totally. I'm all about it. I've been doing a lot of research on trans inclusion in competitions, and that is reading a lot of scientific literature, reading policies of other sports. I recently did a survey of many cis and trans and non-binary cis women and trans and non-binary people in the parkour community, most of whom had participated in competitions as well, to get a sense of like, where does everyone feel about this? So as I'm on the board of USPK that's working on building a national competition. Also because USPK, like one of the things that USPK, again, there's so many tangents in my brain, but one of the things that USPK is tackling is how to, unify the various factions of parkour, and especially in the competition realm of like, if we want to combat FIG, for instance, and like USAG's, like USA Gymnastics involvement in parkour, which is becoming a very big threat to parkour in America, especially as the next Summer Olympics is going to be in LA. Like USAG is ramping up to try to get more people, more parkour people in under their umbrella, right?
How are they ramping up?
Well, one recent thing they just did, a lot of gym owners recently got an email from one of the higher ups at USAG saying, like, tell us how many numbers of people, like trying to do like market research essentially. How many people do you have in your gym? How many people do you serve? And it's like, do we really want to tell them that? Like, because what they're going to do with that is like they're trying to make, so they're doing that. They're trying to make competition formats as well. Like we've seen like more on an international scale as well, where FIG has held a couple competitions. And, while I do not personally fault competitors for going to that, because I get it, it's hard to make money as a professional athlete in parkour, and that is one avenue. I've heard a lot of discontent from people who have competed. I think it was there was a magazine recently that put out like some anonymous interviews from people who competed in the most recent competition, and like the judging is just terrible. Like they have a category that's called, I think it's called like classic parkour.
Oh my God, I heard it. Yeah,
yes.
I've seen it broken down.
Yeah. But like,
that's ridiculous.
Literally,
classics.
You get like, classics.
The classics is insane,
like
and just like the way that they've done what they've done with off-axis, and what they've like. I mean, I don't know who comes up with this, but it seems like they have a completely different understanding than everyone I know in the community
exactly
has of parkour.
It's literally like they're just slapping on gymnastics onto parkour. Like it's something like I think classic movements are like jumps and rail precisions and like literally like parkour movements, and
I think
vaulting.
Callum did some kind of interview, I don't know with who. Damien Puddle, is that the name?
Damien Puddle, yeah.
I haven't listened to it yet, so maybe there's some insight there that
Story recently put out the podcast,
or maybe if you've listened to it you can tell me. But
I would say go ahead and listen to it. Because Damien Puddle is also he's from Parkour Earth, and he's been really involved in all of this stuff on a larger scale internationally, but like these classic movements, like a Kong vault is like no points or like 1 point or something, which is just a complete lack of understanding of the sport. Like what? So there's and an understanding of, because it's so big and bureaucratic, they've given responses of like, it's going to take 4 years to make changes. So is that what we want to see in the Olympics? I don't think so. So we do need to kind of figure out where that's going to go real quick. And one of the ways that we can show power is by saying we're all unified and like, no, go to the governing body over here. Like, I'm not going to talk to you. You need to talk to our governing body. Like us creating a barrier there. So there's that whole thing, which is could be its own podcast episode entirely. And I'm honestly not even the expert for it.
I mean, we did have Adam on, Cozy.
Yeah, Cozy's great.
If you haven't listened to that episode, that would probably be a good place to start as well.
Yeah.
Or another place to jump off
he's
to.
He's another board member, probably the board member who's most knowledgeable of that.
And he talks about the same thing.
Yeah. So there's that. What I've been doing is I've had my finger on the pulse for trans inclusion within parkour competitions. And we're already to a bumpy start, given that, a couple years ago, there was a trans woman who was trying to compete. This is like before the pandemic, was trying to compete at an SBL qualifier. She like podiumed, so she was able, I don't think she even got first place, but like she podiumed, and was then later told that she was not allowed to compete. And then also on top of that, most recently there was another trans woman from the UK who was had reached out to Renee and actually asked, "Can I compete?" at the most recent SPL, and was also barred from competition purely from because of being a trans woman. So there's a lot there. As I yeah, I from what I have read from folks, it is a fear of doing the wrong thing. I think there's also a sort of underlying, like, I don't know. I think there's sort of a protectiveness or saviorism that kind of goes into it as well. I don't want to speak like specifically for anybody, but I do see that pattern of like, I need to do the right thing and protect the women.
Oh, okay. That's what I was wondering. Like, meaning like protect them from
these terrible trans women that are trying to come in.
That's going to come in and dominate the competition.
So that's sort of where we've been, at least in North America, versus in the UK. There have been trans women competing. They are not like winning all competitions, in the women's division. Like they're just competing. So I guess I'll first say I am of the opinion that we need to actually give trans people the opportunity to compete before we actually make blanket decisions. We don't have data. And if you look at like from the scientific literature, I will say, yes, the scientific literature does say that there is an advantage that trans women have, specifically mostly in bone density and muscle density, especially for trans women who transitioned after puberty, right? So I don't think the argument has ever been that there is not an advantage. The argument for why there should be inclusion is it's just one advantage. Like, competition is innately an unfair thing, first of all. If you look at elite athletics, you are seeing, for lack of a better term, genetic freaks rising to the top, of like specialized to their sport. You're going to see long, tall people in like, I don't know, basketball and swimming. You're going to see short people in like weightlifting, right? Like in gymnastics. Yeah, exactly. And like there's specific body types that are showing up. Let alone so that's like one advantage, is like, we're not talking about the advantage of height as well for our sport. We're not talking about the advantage of like various social economic upbringings as well. Like, did you grow up learning parkour in a gym where you had more access to like training every single day with mats? Even just training outdoors versus indoors is going to give you different results in terms of advantage or disadvantage, in a variety of different nuanced ways, right? Because I think
there's I think you already mentioned location, but also resource.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
Just if you come from a family that's going to be able to
afford you to
either you to take classes or support you in driving you to practices and back and forth. Like, there's all manner of things that come into
totally. I mean, you see, like,
development.
Even more broadly, like Simone Biles, in gymnastics, her family owned a gym. So like at that level, a gymnastics gym, right? So like,
shout out what is his name? Ellis Torhall.
Yeah.
Is that the kid whose parents own a gym?
Yeah, right. Like, so like, which is cool.
I mean, yeah, again, it's like,
yeah,
there you go.
It's
There's
gonna
a
happen.
Kid with a freaking gym behind him for sure.
Like that's an advantage.
Not to take anything away from him. He's obviously
Totally.
a freaking monster and very dedicated.
Exactly.
That's where,
and this is the whole thing, is like, I'm not trying to be like, those people shouldn't be allowed to compete because they grew up in a gym. It's like, it's just, we need to acknowledge that sports competition are innately unfair. I actually thought it was very interesting. I don't know if you noticed this at the most recent SPL. There was definitely some body types that were starting to show up within, like, who is the most common body type within speed competitions that are winning. The most common body type between skill competitions, I think especially, was a different body type. Like, you're getting these like beefy Spartans that are like winning the skill competitions at this point, and then like much more leaner, wiry folks in speed. So,
and that would make some sense.
Yeah, and it makes sense. It's not bad.
Yeah, it's interesting because we don't know like the body type, the ultimate, archetype for body in our sports, because like you said, we don't necessarily have the data in yet.
Totally. Yeah, so it's like, so I think that's a really big factor. That, and like, shoot, even adjacent sports to parkour, like people who've been doing flips their whole life are going to be better at, you know, if they, whether it's gymnastics or other disciplines or just before they found parkour, right, are going to have an advantage to, you know, freestyle. And so I think there's just so many more factors, let alone that, like, yes, bone density and muscle density is one factor, one advantage, but we know that just because some bulky dude comes into the gym doesn't mean he's good at parkour. The number of, like, I don't know if you, like, have, as a coach back in the day, like, ever coached, like, a CrossFit guy that wanted to come into the gym. Like, some of the strongest people.
I've coached some thick boys out there and girls. I mean, yeah.
Totally.
Like, there's a certain amount. If you look like Schwarzenegger, you're not the actual metrics aren't going to be good for you for doing parkour per se.
Exactly.
You can lift weights, but that's a different
and
game.
Even CrossFit, which is like a very, like, functional sport, like does not translate to parkour at all. So I think
at all, I don't know if that's
not at all. It's one
but
advantage.
It's not one-to-one.
Using careful languaging there. Yeah.
I know what you mean.
Yeah. So I think if we are more interested in people not having advantages, we need to get curious on what ways do we already create advantages in the sport, and what ways can we help even the playing field, even though knowing, again, competition is innately exclusive because it's all about there's a winner and the loser. Yeah. So it's like, what are we consciously choosing to celebrate, right? And, like, yes, there's an amazing spectacle about who did the biggest jump, you know, who did the, like, most complex flip, you know, like, and I'm here for that, you know. But, like, I think it could be as simple as, you know, in a speed competition, having opportunities for people who are tall and short, or a variety of different, you know, like, and
I would have loved height classes. They got weight classes.
Could have been.
They got weight classes in MMA and fighting and boxing.
There's options.
Not that I'm saying I don't know that would even be the right thing. Totally. And obviously the divisions are already pretty lean across the board in parkour. So it's not like we can create new divisions everywhere and expect it to actually be, because then something comes into play where it's like, okay, well now, so there's a few different arguments against this that I think are worth addressing, just to, like,
do it.
Explore.
Let's go.
So one which just came up was just the financial, and you're not really talking about making new divisions, so this doesn't really apply here. But
I do like. I think it's worth noting that, like, that's the kind of freedom to brainstorm I think we need if we truly care about trans participation, because, again, it's like, we're probably not going to find, like, the solution right now, but like, having freedom to look at, and this is also why I really am, like, anti-Olympics and anti-gymnastics in parkour, is because it's pushing us to have to solidify our sport before we're ready, you know, to fully say this is what our competition looks like, you know.
It's kind of short-sighted in that way. It's like, cool, we can do this quick cash grab now, and, like, everyone that's in the generation that is where it pops in the Olympics gets to benefit, but then potentially everyone afterwards suffers the choices that we made there. But yeah, there's a whole, I mean, and I don't even know if this is what everyone wants. So I guess actually let's go start there. That might be even the most fundamental and, you know, the most common critique I would say I've heard for people is, like, there's this big fear, like you're saying, the savior comes in. The fear is that, well, if we let it play out, then the trans women will be dominating the division of women. And then now that's undermining women's space because they don't necessarily identify with the trans athletes. And so now it's maybe discouraging, you know, I don't know. So I don't know, like, I don't know where your heads are on that. And, like, also what, you know, I'm not any of these categories right now that, like, are marginalized. And so it's hard for me to talk about any of the experiences of any of the people that should be really involved in that conversation. But that's what I've heard, you know, from people that are even maybe having to make the decisions about these things. And also, you know, I know that even some women feel this way, you know, probably within parkour, that this is, like, where they're at with it.
Yeah. So there's a lot.
Please enlighten, you know.
Totally. Yeah. One thing is, I'm just, like, thinking where do I want to go first. One thing is that I've spent the past, I don't know, 6-9 months interviewing a bunch of different, I think I interviewed a little over 70 cis women, and then about I think it was 12 trans and non-binary people in parkour. And I messaged probably about 30 more to actually, because I was like, I just want to lay the land first of all, like where does the community feel, and you know, first of all, so like most of those people that I interviewed were assigned female at birth, you know, including the like non-binary folks, and even there were some trans men that I interviewed as well. And so I think there was like 6 trans women, 6 people, trans women, non-binary people, so that were assigned as male at birth. So that's like, first of all, the lay of the land that I received was that the majority of people, I think it was about 60% of the people I surveyed, said that what they care most about is inclusion within parkour, and they think trans women and trans people in general should just be able to choose their gender within the sport as well. There was another about 30% that was not just cis women, but like again across the board, 30% of people that wanted some sort of restriction, whether that was a hormonal restriction, whether that was like an open division. There was not much agreement for what that looked like, right? So it's really hard to say this is the thing, but there was like, I feel some tension, I want some sort of barrier there. And then there was another 10% that was like, never. Trans women should never compete with cis women. You know, like this is not acceptable. So I think that's important to recognize for people who are looking to be allies for cis women, is to actually make sure you are representing people.
Yeah,
you know?
like, yeah, exactly. Are you actually amplifying the minority voice, thinking that it's the majority voice?
Exactly.
If you're trying to amplify a voice and it's not even your own, or if you're trying to do like what's best on behalf, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
Of what people want. Well, from the studies you've done, and what people want is just to include everybody.
Exactly.
And like, it's so let's aim towards that.
And I do see that there's actually, you know, because the women's community in parkour over the past decade and a half, or at least that I've seen, has been so much more focused on inclusion. And, you know, even look at the way that like many women approach competition, of like, I'm scared to, but I want to do that, so there's representation. You know, I think that I can't speak for everyone, but I think that is a very important thing for the women's community, is that there's just more women, cis or trans. There's just more women. So I think that's thing one. The other thing is, I think we need to be aware of where the assumptions that we make about biological sex affect this. And the reality is that most people have an understanding of biological sex that ended in like the 3rd grade or something, you know, like like you learned about chromosomes, cool, you know, whatever, maybe
You're
that's like
which
8th
one
grade,
am I got a Y, right?
Yeah,
I think.
but here's the thing
Nobody
with that is like, there is also, talking about marginalized communities, you know, intersex people are made invisible in our society. You know, like one way the intersex shows up is like, you know, the baby comes out of the mother and it's got external, you know, genitalia of like the other sex, right? And so they oftentimes, without consent, you know, of the kid, or sometimes even without consent of the parent. Well, I'm sure there's consent of the parents, but like, it's kind of like, it's just like totally understood. They're like, oh, this looks like mostly a girl, so let's make sure it's a girl, you know? So there are people in the intersex community starting to speak up and go, I didn't want that. I would much rather just be intersex and be allowed to be intersex than being forced to be assigned this gender. But the other thing is that intersex doesn't only show up as external traits, it also shows up as internal traits. There are many people who, in the intersex community, who are like, I didn't learn until my 30s because I was like having some sort of, I don't know, hormonal issue, or like I got a scan and turns out I have like internal organs that are different to my assigned gender. So this is a minority. I think I heard the statistic that like intersex is as prevalent as like being a redhead is in our society. So yes, it's a minority, but it does affect athletes, in that there have been recent cases, mostly in the Olympics, where because of these new rules about gender that are coming out to, you know, protect cis women, it's actually we're discovering more about the different ways that like there was a athlete in South Africa, who, I think it was South Africa, but it might have been Madagascar, but somewhere in Africa, where she had to go through hormone testing because she's competing in like the Olympics. Turns out her testosterone levels are higher than every single woman. She was not allowed to participate in the women's division unless she took hormone blockers.
It's like
that's
now they gotta like sandbag somebody because it's like they
Yeah,
made some crazy
totally.
some just line in the sand. But human beings are much more complex than
exactly
you can legislate towards.
Exactly. And like, and we look at testosterone levels as well, you know, it's, if you look at, yeah, there's a lot more complexity to testosterone than just the stereotype that testosterone is a man's hormone. Like
Yeah.
both sexes
Well, and
have, yeah, well, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but
No,
I'm
do
too
it.
late.
Yeah.
My bad.
Yeah, please do.
But we were talking about Osho earlier, and this quote jumped to mind, and like I love this quote from him, and it's just like, it's not a quote, it's a summation. I don't know what he said exactly,
Yeah.
but he talks about, and this is just everyone is half man, half woman, at least. You know, like, we're like, basically he's just talking about you came from your mom and you came from your dad, and I mean, depending on how they identify, and there's different, like, but basically you're getting, there's no such thing as like somebody who's not also a man is also a woman's also a man, is what basically he's saying.
Yeah.
Like,
And
every
I mean,
man is also a woman, and every
Exactly.
woman is also a man.
like,
And there's anyhow,
yeah, no, I'm picking up what you're putting down. I mean, like, you can look more broadly at, like, I can't remember the exacts of this, but humans compared to other species in terms of like biological differences, we have a very small, I'm not like a scientist on this level, but like we have a very small difference between the biological sexes compared to, like, I don't know, like a peacock or like other species that are very, very different, right? So there's looking at that. There's also like going back to like that fun old issue of colonization, of how there's a lot of like our dominant sort of Western culture did a lot to marginalize other gender identity, or like invisibilize is probably the word, like make invisible the other gender identities. You know, there's many indigenous cultures that have an understanding of gender beyond just two genders. And so, like, you know, there's even, if you look at, there's a great book called Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis that talks about the way that Black women were pushed out from the phase when women were trying to get the right to vote in America. And it became a big conflict of like, but do Black women get the right to vote too? Like, and then so there's and a lot of this has to do with like back in slavery days, slaves were not perceived as a gender. Essentially, it was like your property, and you get these big buff Black women essentially because they were working the fields, you know, and a way that white women separated themselves from Black women was by being fair and dainty and like not having muscle mass. So there's a strong, long history in our society, in Western society, that that being female equals weak, right, and motherly. So, or being a woman, anyways, right? So there's just a lot. There's a lot there that we need. So if like if you are trying to, again, if a man is trying to be an ally in this fight, I think they need to be aware of, is there an underlying misogyny that women are innately weaker, and that's why they need to be protected. So, like, I also think of with World Chase Tag as well, and I was really involved with the conversations of getting the first women's division for World Chase Tag. That one of the initial conversations, we had a women's only meetup, and one of the conversations was like, there was one woman who I don't want to name names, but she brought up that like she tried to compete in it, and some guys were like, "You're not fast enough." And this was somebody who was like really, really fast in like speed competitions. And so there's just like, and while there was never a women can't compete in World Chase Tag, there were a couple women that did compete before there was a women's division. I think it's like important for us to look at, you know, are we sometimes creating these divisions just because it's like the thing to do, or like could co-ed spaces be more like maybe we should go back to more co-ed spaces. But if we do want to do more co-ed competition, we need more diverse competition formats as well, right? That are not going to, like, yes, there is advantage for, you know, like, yes, most men jump further than women. That's not like a question, right? And like, yes, there are, but like, I've talked to so many men in parkour who are like, I'm afraid to compete. I would love the privilege of being able to compete, but like, I can't qualify for the men's division. So it's, again, what do we want to do with competition? I think is a really larger question as we're trying to figure out, you know, what's the right format for us.
Yeah, like you said, there's a lot there.
There's a lot there.
There's just so much there. I mean, yeah, it's, man.
I will say, just going back to like trans inclusion, the IOC, literally like yesterday, I don't know if they put it, like literally as of this week, the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, just put out a new trans inclusion policy, and it does specifically say you cannot exclude someone specifically just for their gender, for the gender they're trying to compete in. They do need to compete in a gender that they live in. So like somebody who's a cis man can't be like, I'm gonna be a woman for tomorrow's competition. Like that's, you know. So no, it does need to be like your lived gender, and it needs to be sport specific. So it's no longer a blanket. It was for the Olympics, it was like a blanket, like levels of testosterone in order to compete in the women's division. They were doing all this testing, right? So now they are leaving it up to the sports governing bodies to choose, because like, again, we're also discovering that women actually have biological women have an advantage in endurance over men. And so it's not a blanket for all sports now. Yeah. And so it's sport specific. And the guidelines are, it cannot be a blanket, like, you know, you can't participate because of your gender, which goes back to a human rights issue. If we look at Title IX, which was a policy that was passed in America back in, it was its 15th anniversary most recently. And Title IX was around, you know, like there's the stereotype of running competitions where like way back in the day there was like, women can't possibly do marathons, it'll hurt their uteruses, kind of like.
I didn't know that went that ridiculous, but I'm not surprised that it was that ridiculous.
So again, sports have always been political, and for the longest time running has a strong history of like women's inclusion and the fight that women did to like participate in 4Ks and marathons and, you know, like all that. The history of the sports bra is connected to the history of running, like fascinating stuff like that, which is also ironic because running is like an extremely perceived as co-ed sport nowadays, right? So I think we can take a lot from running. But I've just lost my train of thought because I've gone on too many tangents.
Oh no, you're good.
Where did I come?
I don't know. You were talking about Title IX and how.
Oh yeah.
Running
so
is like
human rights. We need to be recognizing that, like, to just say that someone cannot compete because they're trans is discrimination. Because sure, you could maybe make the art, like, I get that maybe you want to make the argument for, like, we could go down the testosterone or, like, you know, rabbit hole with that. There are complications with that. Like, but then again, is someone who is in their 40s and just came out as a trans woman and was not athletic before, can she not compete because she's trans? That makes no sense.
Well, and like I think what you were pointing to earlier, at least a little bit, was where are we at now? Like, yeah, there's a whole idealized version of it. Maybe we can hash these things out, tease everything out, and maybe we'll find some things that surprise us or whatever. Yeah. But right now, everyone just wants to be included, and it's not a big deal. And at least until it's a problem, let's see what happens.
Totally.
Because it's not even a thing until we let it be.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's really well said. Because it is, I think it comes back to, like, so Title IX is all about that people cannot be excluded by gender, right? And it happened because of, like, women in running, for instance. And so it is a human rights issue at this point of, like, human beings deserve to participate in sports. And it is again, you cannot be excluded based off of gender from this Title IX policy in America specifically. So I think we need to be aware of, again, where we unintentionally, as a parkour community, unintentionally creating exclusion. And I think my last point as well is that, like, I don't know if as a parkour community, we want to have highly regulated testing to participate. You know, like, we don't do drug testing in competitions. Like, I think half the people probably couldn't compete if we did drug testing in parkour, right? So why is it fair that we're now needing to prove that trans people need to, like, prove their documentation that they've been on hormones for so long, or their hormone levels are this or whatnot, right? Like, and if we want to be fair, we need to test everyone. So are we gonna just make the trans people prove that they're passing enough with their hormones? Like, that's no. You would need to then test all the cis people too, which then we're gonna discover that some people may have higher hormone levels, or some people maybe are intersex without them discovering. That's a whole mess right there that I don't think we are hopefully not interested in, right? And
I'm not interested in doing any of that.
Yeah. So the other thing too is, like, not everybody looks trans. There's this whole assumption that, like, everyone knows what a trans person looks like. I'm sure there are many people out there who didn't know that someone is trans. And I think that's important to let people not have to out themselves, because it's not always safe in society to be out as a trans person, especially for, you know, a variety of places in America right now. So we need to let people be private with it if they want to, and participate. And, you know, like I've said, the people who are the trans folks who are competing internationally are not, like, winning across the board. You know, if competition, I'll wrap up by saying, if competition organizers want to create a more fair playing field, they need to, you know, create more diverse challenges, you know, like more in skill, maybe it's more mental or technical challenges in addition to big jumps, right? That's, you know, already makes it like a more even playing field. In speed, maybe that looks like having some, like, small like holes to climb through kind of stuff or whatever, you know, smaller spaces versus, like, always having to take the high route.
Okay, so here's where things get complicated again.
Yeah.
Not that, like, but you just made me
because you're
think
not
of
some
something.
Joe Schmo in competition. You've done a lot in competition.
I'm a Joe Schmo. I just caught the right time where no one knew until it was all over. But so reflective of the sport is where I wanted to go, because competition needs to also reflect the sport if it's to mean anything, and not to say that, like,
oh yes, I know where you're going with this. Yeah.
And not to say that there's not small holes. I mean, Tom, our friend Tom Coppola, does some serious small hole work. Like, that's our boy. He's out there doing the work in that department, and we've seen, you know, we've seen some cool stuff. But all that to say, where competition starts to reflect the sport and making it fair, and it becomes this catch-22, because what's influencing what is reflected in the sport, and it kind of brings it back full circle to where we started, is these extreme things, these out of, like, your mind kind of, like, in, you know, activities or massive jumps or huge, just all of it extreme is what people kind of feel like is the culture.
And there's tension there, yeah, because again, that's the spectacle. So this is I think our like values check-in as a sport, as a parkour community trying to build competitions, is like, how can we know we want competitions to reflect the sport. Okay, what is the sport? Because there's already different kinds of parkour that are not reflected in competition. Like, you're never going to see like a whole bunch of rail flow, for instance, in a freestyle competition, right? And a lot of women really gravitate towards like a rail flow sort of style. So, but that's definitely free running. I would not call rail flow if we're trying to do like the parkour versus free running BS, like,
well, no, it's interesting, but you made me think. I'm like, okay, what would that be like in a different sport that more everyone can understand? Like, if the World Cup just happened, there's like competitions where people do just like dribbling work, and they're just like bouncing on their forehead and bouncing on their shoulders and doing anything, to showcase how well they have ball control, but they're not trying to score goals.
Exactly.
And it's like, so I guess, what are your thoughts on that? Because obviously the World Cup, what everyone's going to watch, where the most money is, where the most eyeballs are these
epic games between nations and whatever.
Yeah.
But
Well said. Yeah.
But then there's whole other explorations of it. And is it enough is it going to be enough for someone to have like, well, this is my dribbling competition, or this is like, or do they want the World Cup to reflect some of the skills that they can do, essentially?
Yeah,
Do you know what I mean?
I think this is why we like need more time to explore and develop. Like there were some online competitions, I think over the pandemic, that was like, I think there was like a team competition where people were doing like rail flow together. Pretty Parkour did a really cool like flow competition online as well. So like, I don't think we need to necessarily like choose this is the right one, but I think there is a encouragement for more people to experiment with competition formats, and just play with it, right? I think that's one thing, is like more people should make up wacky competitions.
More wackiness.
Yeah.
Just not even, doesn't have to be wacky, just can be different, can be new, can be refreshing.
Exactly. I think World Chase Tag came out of a wacky competition,
True.
And parkour athletes love it. So more competition. I think the value of competition is that it does push people to get better, and it gives people like, goalposts as like, this is where I'm going to work to achieve to. As someone who is like never won a competition except for if there were no other women there, like I still love competition because I love getting to like push myself and challenge, and there's something magical about that support that you get when you are on the floor as a competitor, and I want more people to experience that at the end of the day. I think that's a really cool thing that we should share with people. But there is that like innate conflict, because where the money is at is the spectacle. So I don't think it is a black and white thing of like no spectacle is allowed in parkour, right? But I think there's just keeping a balance of that. And again, balance is not like a line. We all know from practicing balancing is wobbly. So I think it's very okay for us to keep experimenting and finding that balance. In some years we're like, oh, that was way too spectacle and people didn't really feel like that represented the sport. And some years that wasn't spectacle enough and nobody watched it. So we got to keep, kind of dancing back and forth with the balance of that.
I love that. Yeah, I love where you landed with that. It's perfect, I think. It's active, it's a balancing, it's a movement that you have to. It's just like parkour. You can't just like hold a position and you're
perfectly
no longer
balanced
doing
on the rail. Yeah.
Like
I made
we
it.
get it. It's like, all right, well, you're gonna fall over at that point. Really cool. I think we could wrap it up there. I don't know how you feeling. You feeling good? Anything else you want to talk about?
I think we hit all of it. That's probably enough.
All right.
Let's see
where are we at. Yeah, that's good. We were about an hour and 40 in here, so
yeah, that's probably
thanks for being on the program. And then we'll have more fun now that this is done.
Thanks.
See you guys later. Oh yeah. Big love to Cory for joining the program. Thank you guys all for listening. Hopefully we'll have many more with them, because there's so much to talk about still. And Parkour Visions is doing so much amazing work. We didn't even really scratch the surface on it. And I hope you guys will go into the description and visit the links so you can see a little bit more what PKV is up to and what Cory's doing and their whole board. So, yeah, big moves. Thank you guys for being a part of this one. We'll see you on the next one in the next year.